Hi everyone, welcome to the University of Guelph Arboretum. My name is Michelle and I'm the Summer Naturalist here at the Arboretum, and I'm super excited to be back for another weekly Wednesday video. Today I'm going to be talking all about ecosystems. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is basically a defined space where biotic or living factors interact with abiotic or non-living factors. And biotic factors can include anything from plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, basically anything that's alive. And abiotic factors are the opposite. So they include things like temperature, water, air, rocks, basically anything that's non-living. And within an ecosystem, all of the biotic factors occupy their own ecological niche. A niche is basically an organism's position in its ecosystem. So it includes what that organism needs to survive, the food and habitat it occupies, and how it interacts with its environment to function and have its own specific role. Studying ecosystems can be a bit tricky because it really all comes down to what you want to define as an ecosystem. I could say all of planet Earth is one big ecosystem, but that might be a little bit too overwhelming to study and understand. So instead I could break it down smaller and say the Arboretum is the ecosystem I'm going to be looking at. Or maybe I'm only interested in Victoria Woods, where I'm at today, and I could say Victoria Woods is the ecosystem I'm interested in studying. Or maybe I'm really interested in only aquatic systems, and I say just the pond in Victoria Woods is the ecosystem I'm looking at. So it really comes down to how you want to define an ecosystem. And that can be a little bit overwhelming to think of, to say all of planet Earth or all of the Arboretum can be one ecosystem. That's a lot. But I think being able to define an ecosystem really into any size and shape makes studying them really interesting. Because I could say that tree behind me is its own ecosystem. And I could look at all the biotic and abiotic factors on that tree and learn a little bit about how those organisms work together. Now, to study an ecosystem, a lot of time you can look at a food web. And the reason for that is because a food web tells you a lot about the flow and transfer of energy within an ecosystem. So when you look at a food web, you often start with the primary producers. And that's because primary producers are the base of every and all ecosystems. Primary producers are organisms that produce instead of consume. So those are organisms that don't need to eat other animals to make energy. A lot of primary producers will use photosynthesis to make energy. So plants are an excellent example of primary producers. They use photosynthesis, water and nutrients from the soil to grow and create energy. After primary producers comes primary consumers. These are organisms that are often herbivores or only eat plant matter, and they will feed on the primary producers. Good examples of these guys would be rabbits, deer, caterpillars. These are all animals that only eat plant matter. After primary consumers comes secondary consumers. These are carnivores or animals that eat other animals. And that could include things like a snake or a raccoon. And after those secondary consumers comes the tertiary consumers. And these guys are kind of like the top dogs in a food web. These guys are carnivores, so they eat other animals, but they tend to have very few or no predators. A good example of a tertiary consumer is a great horned owl. So a great horned owl eats other animals, but they basically sit at the top of their food web. There is very little that eats a great horned owl. Basically nothing is able to take them down if they're a healthy adult. And to round out a food web comes the detribors. These are the organisms that feed on decaying organic matter. So you can think of things like earthworms, isopods, and fungi are all organisms that are super important for breaking down organic matter. And that's really an important job because when they break down organic matter, they're feeding the soil, which in turn feeds the primary producers. So looking at how all of these organisms function within their food web can tell you a lot about how energy is moved and transferred. If you think of that caterpillar that we started off with as a primary consumer, well, it eats plants. But let's say that caterpillar grows up into a beautiful monarch butterfly and goes on to be a pollinator. So now it goes on to help primary producers. And let's say secondary consumers are really important for sometimes controlling the population of primary consumers. So if nothing was eating the rabbits and the rabbits ate too much of the primary producers, it could cause a problem for the ecosystem because plants are the basis of every ecosystem. And interactions of predator and prey aren't always super clear and easy to look at. So just because one thing is a predator to another thing doesn't mean it's not going to be something else's prey. So all of these interactions are really complex and really interesting to look at. So I think we should look at Victoria Woods as its own ecosystem to learn a little bit about how the biotic and abiotic organisms and factors are working together. So we'll give Victoria Woods, or the small section of trail that's around me, a quick look, and we'll say that this is the ecosystem we're going to be looking at. So as we look around Victoria Woods, the small trail section that I'm around, you'll instantly notice there's a whole lot of primary producers. There's a lot of trees and shrubs around me, and these guys form the basis of this ecosystem. So all the primary producers that I just showed you have a lot of different important roles within an ecosystem. So not only are primary producers creating basically all the food for the ecosystem, because a primary producer will feed a primary consumer, that'll feed a secondary consumer, that'll feed a tertiary consumer. So primary producers create basically a lot of food for an ecosystem, but they also produce a lot of shelter and habitat in this ecosystem. So around me, you could probably hear a lot of birds, but you can't really see any of them. I'm having trouble finding them as well. And that's because all the primary producers are creating some awesome shelter and habitat for a lot of animals that live in this ecosystem. Primary producers also can influence abiotic factors. So today, it's quite sunny out, but I'm actually very shaded where I'm at because all of the primary producers around me are shading me from the sun. And that means this section of Victoria Woods is actually a little bit cooler than if I were to stand on the other side of Victoria Woods in an open field. I'd be a bit warmer because the sun's hitting me a lot more. Now there's a lot of secondary primary consumers in this ecosystem, and they're very tricky to see because they're all doing a really good job of hiding. There was actually a rabbit sitting in front of me while I was filming earlier, but unfortunately it has moved on. So that rabbit is a really good example of a primary consumer. So it's going to eat some plant matter in this ecosystem. It also helps the ecosystem through its droppings. So animal droppings can be broken down into the soil and actually fills the soil with a lot of nutrients and makes it richer. There's also a lot of secondary consumers and tertiary consumers in this ecosystem that are also quite difficult to see. I saw a red-tailed hawk fly into one of those trees back in the distance, but unfortunately with all of the cover that these primary producers are creating, I guess it's good for the red-tailed hawk because it's going unnoticed right now, it's very tricky to see and show off to you. But all the secondary and tertiary consumers have a really important role of keeping other populations in check. And that's because if any population is allowed to really go out unchecked, it can create a lot of problems for an ecosystem. And that's one of the reasons why invasive plants and animals are so impactful for ecosystems, because most of the time invasive organisms basically go unchecked within an ecosystem. Garlic mustard, if nothing really feeds on it, basically is allowed to just grow wild on forest floor and overtake all of the other primary producers or a lot of the primary producers that use the forest floor as their home. So it's really important for secondary and tertiary consumers to keep other organisms in check. Now, if I flip a log that's behind me, I think we're gonna get some really good looks. So I flipped over a small log and I've come across all of this fungi. This fungi is probably working really hard to decompose this dead log. When I flipped over this log, I also saw a lot of isopods that quickly scurried away, so you can't see them right now. But those are all really good examples of organisms that break down decaying matter. You may be wondering why it's so important to know and understand ecosystems. Well, understanding how biotic and abiotic factors work together to make a healthy ecosystem can tell you a lot about what you can do to help conserve ecosystems. A healthy ecosystem can support a lot of biodiversity. It can help keep water clean and produce food for us. Ecosystems are not only important for the plants and animals that call it their home, but it's also really important for us. I hope after watching this video, you guys will all go out and try to explore ecosystems, maybe in your own backyard, or come out to the Arboretum and check out all the different ecosystems that we have here. I hope you guys will join me next week for another Weekly Wednesday video.